My name is Susan Ely, and please feel free to call me Susan. I'm in the engineering department, faculty here, and I have a background as an industrial engineer, and my master's and doctorate are both also in the engineering fields. But I also did pick up a graduate certificate from Purdue's School of Education in instructional design, and I actually spend a lot of my time looking at retention of vulnerable populations in engineering fields. And I've spoken before about how engineering in particular is a field that has some resistance. Many STEM fields do. They're usually dominated by white men, and there's nothing wrong with white men, but it means that they're usually skewed when we look at diversity and equity and inclusion. And so part of my role in our Pot College Council on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion is I come with that perspective of having been the only female engineer or the only female engineering professor in various forms. And so that's a role, being the only one in my particular field, in my as representing my gender. That's something pretty common to me. And it's caused me to want to further investigate other areas of equity, inclusion, and social justice. And I think that as we continue to see increases in technology, unfortunately, we do not necessarily see increases in equity. And that's a frustration of mine, and I think it frustrates a lot of people. And so as I share today, I don't claim to be an expert in any one area of these. Again, all of my training is as an engineer, but this is an area of research of mine that I continue to try to educate myself and bring higher levels of understanding so that I can encourage others and potentially be part of a solution to increase areas of equity and inclusion and social justice in those spheres for which I have influence. And for most of us, I think that's what we can do, is that we can look at how we can positively influence the spheres we're already in. There are some people who will be global just radical changers to our communities. And, we think of like Nelson Mandela, obviously today's named in his sake, and he was a global changer. But for most of us, I think the changes are more subtle. I think most of our involvement is going to be in those little circles that we already travel, in the people that we already meet, in the students we interact with, in the peers that we interact with as faculty or staff or industry. And I think that that's important too, that even in our small circles that we remain diligent to see how we can continue to move the needle to a more equitable place. And that's the framework with which I approach this. And so as we go through, you might have questions that I can't answer. And you might bring up topics that I'm not really well versed in. And that's okay, because the goal of this is to be a facilitated discussion. This isn't just a lecture. I have slides prepared that I want to talk through that give some examples, but it's not at all a comprehensive lecture on this topic, and certainly I'm not looking to fill an hour of just me talking. I already do that enough for my job that I don't need to do that for this as well. And so as we continue, please feel free to ask questions. I think I have like 13 slides to just walk through a couple case studies and see examples. And then after I've done that, I hope that we can use the remainder of the time in discussion, whether that's exploring some of these topics a little deeper, or if it's giving your own experience and giving voice to the experiences you've seen or that you've seen with your students or in your societal settings. But whatever the case may be, that we could explore that together and hopefully learn something from one another and maybe encourage one another in this area. And so that's really the intent of my work today. And I hope that that is worthy of your time and something that you are able to enjoy. And so I think you can see my screen now. Can I get a thumbs up from someone, or I don't know if there's And always you can use the chat, and I think we have other people here to help facilitate some of those things as well. So without further ado, my focus was really, again, on technology because that's my background, looking at engineering solutions in the world and how they may impact our society. And it is both in positive and negative ways. And so I want to start with a quote from a fellow engineer, industrial engineer, and who started me down this path in social justice, and then kind of look through some of the ways that technology is helping. Some ways technology can actually detract from our experience, and then talk about some ways that we can listen to one another, listen to our students, listen to our communities, so that we might benefit one another and increase a more cohesive community feeling where everyone has equal access and everyone has equal voice. And so one of the things that this engineer noticed was that commonly we design for sameness. And this designing for sameness, especially as an industrial engineer, often comes in the form of statistical analysis, where we look at populations and we actually look at the mean for population characteristics. And so we design for uniformity. And that has set us back as a community, as a people, in areas of equity and social justice. Because if we're looking at medians and means, and we're looking at trying to stay within, under the curve, under that widest part of our curve, when we do our statistical analysis, we create further disparity. There's privilege given to the overprivileged, and we further disenfranchise those who are already struggling, because those who are in the tails of the curve, those who are in those minority populations, automatically are dismissed. From a research standpoint, we think of those ends, the sample size, as being small and neglecting them. And so because of that, a lot of our intentional design is intentionally unequitable. And we use theories that have been developed in a previous framework that focused on white middle to upper class citizens, especially here in America. The theories that govern the creation of infrastructure, the theories that govern education, the theories that inform our political systems, all of these have been based on a white middle to upper class citizen group that is privileged. And again, we are disenfranchising those who are already struggling. And we use those theories to explain and analyze and diagnose everyone. And we look from a perspective of, what's the gap between them and me, and how can I potentially bring them to where I am, without any consideration that they may not want to be where I am, without any consideration to their own identity, to their cultural framework, to their uniqueness. We don't highlight the differences. We try to muddle them out in averages and statistics to try to make everyone the same. And so if we're going to ever challenge this framework in design, in engineering, in technology, then we have to actually be truly people-centered. And being people-centered is looking at individual persons, not groupings, not the statistical significance of one group compared to another. And to do that, we would be able to create frameworks that actually are inclusive, that celebrate diversity, and thereby positively impact social justice. But this is a dramatic shift. This isn't where we are currently. It's where some people are currently, and we're seeing more. But there's a lot to undo. There's a long history of these theories and approaches that continue to have a homogenous approach, and to try to make everyone the same rather than look at any of those differences. And so this is a change in mindset that is not appreciated or even welcomed by all of those who are in places of authority or decision making, or in allocating funding, and that becomes a problem for those individuals who are disenfranchised. And so starting with looking at some places that technology helps, how technology increases access, I want to highlight a few things that I think are pretty cool. One of the philosophies here is that equal resources are needed for equal access. And this isn't the pinnacle of where we need to be. This is just a starting point. This is recognizing that when we don't have equal resources, we can't have equal expectations of what is made of those resources, or what gains can be gotten. If people are already starting with an incomplete set of tools, they will not be able to accomplish in the same way, and therefore resources are required. So there's a place in Colombia that had been known in the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s as the murder capital of the world. And it was plagued by gang violence. It was plagued by corruption within the government. It was plagued by a law enforcement that was extraordinarily biased and corrupt as well. And so early in those 60s, 70s, early 80s, there was migration, and the migration of the population to remove themselves from places of danger caused them to geographically move up the hill. So if you look at the second picture that says geographical divide, you see that there's this large mountain, and Colombia is fairly mountainous, and the poor communities were not safe in their own setting. And so to try to increase their safety, to try to protect themselves from this violence and corruption, they moved into these mountainous areas that posed a lot of challenges. They didn't have schools, they didn't have libraries, there was no public transportation, the infrastructure was nearly non-existent, and so they became just an impoverished community. And when we think about extreme poverty is a circumstance in which normal measures can't get you out of it. That most people born into extreme poverty will also die in extreme poverty, because simply getting up and working every day is not sufficient to change that status, to move the needle enough, that you need some additional intervention to move out of those characteristics that are associated with extreme poverty, whether it be healthcare, whether it be access to clean water, whether it be utilities or educational resources. That there isn't an infrastructure for those in extreme poverty to actually elevate themselves. They're simply surviving. If you think of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they're still in that basic security. How am I going to eat? Where am I going to sleep? How will I feed my child? Those types of questions are the most pressing. And so reaching a pinnacle of self-actualization is something that never encounters their mind, because that's so far away from the reality in which they live. And so this geographical divide caused these poor residents to worsen their circumstances in almost every way in an effort to maintain safety and security. However, they didn't. They were followed by that gang violence and by drug cartels and other disreputable sorts that would bring violence and disruption and chaos into their lives. And so in an effort to change this, there was government intervention, and they actually went into these areas and they talked to absolutely everyone. They were discussing with gang members why the gangs acted the way they did. They were discussing with people who had no education what their next step would be if they were capable of taking it. They talked to the homeless. They talked to every person, every type of constituent group, instead of focusing on those who had the capabilities of coming to a public civic meeting and having a forum to discuss these things in civilized manners. The people that were going to make these changes, the engineers that were involved, the designers that were involved, the funding sources were both government and NGOs. And what they did was they actually went and talked to all of the constituents. They went to where the individuals were, rather than making decisions in some lofty boardroom somewhere downtown. They actually went into the communities and said, what do you need? And one of the things that was highlighted was this geographic divide, that it was a 2-hour commute to go anywhere, to get anything, any sort of medical services, any sort of educational services, any food beyond what they could grow or raise in their own, kind of local area, would require a 2-hour commute walking down this mountain and then carrying with them everything to come back up. And so the first thing they did was actually they built a cable car system. And if you look at the far left-hand picture, you'll see these covered escalators. And that was another piece of infrastructure that was built in. That they started trying to create rapid transit between this mountainous area and the valley, which had a much higher degree of wealth and services, where all of the wealth and services were actually maintained. And so by reducing that 2-hour commute to a 15-minute commute, all of a sudden the idea of sending your child to a school was no longer inconceivable. All of a sudden the idea of working in the city was no longer a barrier. And so it radically changed their access to those amenities that were already in the city. But that's not where they stopped. They actually looked at how they could increase the amenities in this mountainous region. And it wasn't just simply building a school or building a doctor's office or an emergency room or a hospital. They wanted to make it beautiful. They wanted to make it a community that individuals would be proud of, so that they were no longer in exile of this city that they were born in, but rather that they were embracing their own community, that they hadn't escaped another population, but rather that they could thrive where they were. And all of those were done with the input and insight from the individuals who were living in those communities. And now it is characterized with lots of tourism, and they've continued the beautification, and they've continued to develop the arts. They've continued to invest in music and local artists, and are radically changing in just a few decades the overall tenor of that community, the overall wealth, not just for the ones who were already wealthy, and really taking those people that are in extreme poverty and giving that intervention that allows them to move into places that are more sustainable and healthy, to allow them to increase their opportunities to continue to grow within their communities and become no longer impoverished, but people that actually had a voice, and people that had potential and career opportunities and educational opportunities and skills and trades, and benefit their own society. Another one domestically was actually in Des Moines, Iowa. And so there's a center that's run out of Iowa State University, and they have a team, and this is one of several research teams working there, and it's called the Sustainable Cities Decision Making Research Team. And this is a team that is interdisciplinary. It has human factors engineering, industrial engineering, it has agricultural specialists, it has anthropologists, it has sociologists and psychologists, it has early education and child development, it has individuals from healthcare professions, and all different types of civil engineers, anybody who could contribute to what an overall community would require, that makes up this research team. And so it's a very holistic approach to looking at problems specifically associated with food, water, and energy. And so one of the things that has been impacting Iowa in all manners is that as there has been climate change, the most vulnerable populations are the ones that have been impacted the most. The increases in the cost of energy are felt most often by those who are incapable of finding additional interventions. So while others who have own their own home, could invest in things to reduce their energy bills. If you're in an apartment moving from lease to lease and have no stake in that actual property, you can't make changes to it to become more energy efficient, to reduce your overall energy cost. If there are issues with the water supply, which are in many places of the United States actually have difficulties with contaminated water supplies that lead to various types of diseases and cancers and genetic illnesses that are seen. Again, this happens all over the nation, but Iowa is one of those locations. If you're living based on what the lowest cost for residency may be, you're also in a place that has the worst water pipes and infrastructure, and you have very little resources to make any sort of improvements yourself. And so what these researchers focused on, one of their projects was focusing on trying to engage these populations that really had no say in those areas of life. They simply worked with what they had, and that was all that they could do. They couldn't say, yes, we want to be more energy efficient, because they didn't have any stake in the buildings that they were living in. They couldn't change what water they had. They couldn't access more sustainable food choices. They simply had to make do with what was available in their economic capabilities. And so the researchers realized that if they wanted to make a difference in these areas, they needed to reach out to those people directly and speak to them. But there were a lot of barriers. There were language issues. There was a large immigrant population, and there were many seasonal workers who migrated based on where the work would be, and they didn't necessarily speak English. There were individuals who had childcare needs or elder care needs and were not able to attend forums even if they had a desire to. There were transportation issues where they didn't own their own car and couldn't attend meetings that were far away from them. And so in doing this research of trying to be inclusive, it became more than just the wish of, well, we'll invite everyone. They realized that if they actually wanted to include everyone in a sustainable design that positively impacted all levels of the community, they would have to go to where those individuals were. And so they went to those communities, those poorer communities, the immigrant communities, the ones that didn't have English as a first language, those who didn't have access to their own private transportation or own their own homes. And they went into those communities with individuals who were already respected within those areas. They went in with translators. They went in with childcare workers. They provided transportation if they were wanting to take them somewhere else, because by doing so, they were able to collect data that actually represented all of the citizens, all of the residents of Des Moines, not just those that had the personal inclination and the means for being part of a civic discussion. And so the changes that were made and the improvements that were done in those areas were based on the knowledge gained by having inclusive data practices, data gathering practices. And so this is being practiced in multiple areas within the Iowa State University, and they coordinate with various other constituencies. They're funded by the National Science Foundation through grants and other types of grants. And they are able to leverage resources that the individual residents would never have had access to on their own. And they're able to make improvements. They're able to talk to landlords and make improvements to entire apartment buildings to help assist those who wouldn't be able to make improvements to their own residencies. And so those types of steps are available to us through advances in technology when we take the steps to be inclusive of who is part of that conversation. But technology can also hurt. It can amplify gaps. And we've seen this in our own economy pretty continually as we look at automation in the workforce. And this is something that is directly related to work that I had done as an industrial engineer. Automation in the workforce has actually increased productivity as a nation if you measure by the GDP and the number of units outputted and exported and also consumed by our nation. But the wage gap between white and non-white households has also increased. And disproportionately, actually, the wage gap has increased at a greater rate than our productivity. And so while automation is helpful and can bring in some additional resources and open up more opportunities for new types of jobs, those jobs often require a knowledge base that isn't available to those outside of having resources to obtain some sort of post-secondary education. Also, typically there's been a geographic mismatch for job seekers and where the new jobs are taking place. For example, if you look at some of the new high-tech distribution centers that are being installed by Amazon around our nation, they're rarely in city centers because they need space. And so space puts them in rural areas, but there's no public transportation in rural areas. And so it's not like a downtown Manhattan location where people can hop on a subway for a reasonable fare. It's someplace that people have to take a bus as close as they can get and then walk the remainder of the distance, or not have transportation at all. And so when we look at the advancements that come along with automation and engineering solutions, we're actually increasing the divide in our workforce. We're making it more difficult for individuals to obtain those jobs without having access to post-secondary education, having access to reliable personal transportation. And so these are some factors that actually increase the gap between what we're doing from a technology standpoint, which seems to be positive, and what's actually accessible to all individuals. A researcher actually coined this term tequity, and he's a K-12 researcher, spent 20 years in instructional design and in the classroom, K-12 classrooms. And one of the things that he has recognized as there's been this migration towards one-to-one devices for enhanced learning, he himself was also teaching during COVID, and so like many of us who are educators had to quickly change platforms. And while I was reaching out to college students, I can't imagine the difficulty that our K-12 educators had reaching out to like fourth graders or first graders. It boggles my mind. And so there's this idea that we can enhance learning with these digital experiences, that they have access to everything the internet has to offer, and that this whole generation of young scholars is coming as digital natives, that they're coming up in a world that has all of these technologies accessible, where I didn't have a personal email address until I was in college. And so we think of them as being technically savvy. We think of them as having all of these additional skills. And we think that if we put a device in their hand, and everyone has the same device in their hand, that they're somehow leveling the playing field. But one of the things that has been noted by this researcher and as many others is that for students that lack reliable high-speed internet at home, the fact that the device was put in their hand is really meaningless. If they are, and I'll tell you, I live in the county and I have terrible internet. I have to use my cell phone hotspot for internet when working from home. And so there are documented cases of students that have to do their homework at McDonald's, or students who sit outside in parking lots of places that offer free Wi-Fi so that they connect, so that they can actually complete their homework assignments. And the lack of that reliable high-speed internet at home is a problem that is in the process of being addressed both with infrastructure dollars at the national and the state level. However, it moves very slow. The installation of that is just one aspect where the idea of putting a Chromebook in everybody's hands sounds like an open door to invite everyone to engage with education the same way. And yet, as soon as they leave the school building, it's no longer the same. And in fact, the expectations for some educators can be higher than what is actually possible based on their home infrastructure. Assignments themselves can be biased against vulnerable populations. This author actually wrote a story about how that first day assignment that many K-12 teachers might think, I know I've done it many times myself, what did you do over summer vacation? And the disparity in the answers within his classroom of individuals who were able to take vacations, maybe go to Disney World or an Airbnb in Florida, and those who were left home alone while their parents went to work all day, or in some of the older grades, those that had to work all day themselves to help contribute to their family's financial situation. the assignment itself creates a divide between the learners, between the haves and the have-nots. And so it's not only the access to the technology, but the recognition that the students themselves have different circumstances as soon as you leave that classroom, and they bring that with them when they're sitting under your instruction. And so the tequity, the idea that technology can build in the equity, cannot be done without understanding the support systems that these individuals have outside. It's also important to note, and I'm sure if I have any K-12 educators on, that you could speak to this better than I can. My mother was a K-12 educator, she's retired now, but administrators regulate what you're allowed to do, what platforms you use. Frankly, I'd be thrilled if we didn't have to use Blackboard. If there's other technologies better than Blackboard, but USI is a Blackboard school. But even at the K-12 level, where the curriculum is so highly regimented and regulated, that those curricular demands can also produce greater divides. So even though the technology is there to create access, the way in which K-12 educators are being told to deliver that content can actually disenfranchise some users and at the same time benefit others. And so that inequity continues. And then furthermore, this author actually looks to just the idea that cell phone savvy does not equal internet or computer literacy, that this generation coming up very much understands mobile devices, but actually having internet literacy and being able to bring discernment to what type of resources are used or how to trust different internet hosted platforms and content. All of those things that are part of the instruction are actually new to our students. And I can tell you that when I do research papers with my engineering students, that we actually have to do a unit on what types of sources are reliable sources for information, because it is not automatically understood by all users simply because we have cell phones that we can, play Wordle on. So understanding these differences between the expectations of what we thought technology could do and what it is actually done in the classroom is something that we have to be really mindful of. And dependent on the situation as we find ourselves as educators, some of us have more liberties than others. I have my curricular objectives, but I have a lot of autonomy of how I approach those. K-12 has less and less autonomy on how they are able to approach those curricular objectives, and less opportunity to customize that education to individual learners. And the technology itself is not the silver bullet that makes everything okay. It's the delivery that is going to really impact. And so this brings us to my last kind of thought before we open up in discussion is, how do we listen and who are we listening to? So there was this study that was done very recently in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia had been a large blue collar economy, that there were coal mines there and railroads, and they had a lot of industry. And in the post-industrial decline, there led to a lot of crime. Their educational standards really declined. They found that there was an increase in homelessness and poverty. And so to attack this, they looked to incorporate smart city technology to bring a revitalization to the area. The problem is that 25% of the population was still living below the poverty line. And so this study was done just last year, and surveyed a large number of urban youth between 14 and 18. And they were talking through all of the different types of technology integration that they had done with smart cities. And so some of these smart cities were like real-time tracking of the buses, and the buses having an app to your phone so that you could see when a particular bus would be at a particular bus stop, and you could pay your fare through your phone. They had chargers embedded on the bus themselves so that if your battery was drained on your commute home, you could just plug your charger in. And so that's just one of the innovations that they had. And so they talked to the youth about their perspectives on these smart tech. And they talked both about the public spaces and the private spaces, because they had also looked to increase the power of like their 5G capability, their fiber capability for high-speed internet, in addition to the public offerings. And the researchers were able to help the youth categorize what types of things were just convenience that were helpful and what was transformational, like what actually changed the way they approached their life. And so kind of that nice to have, it's the convenience, you know, like plugging my phone on, letting it charge while I'm sitting at the bus stop, like that's certainly helpful, but it doesn't necessarily change my world. It just means that my phone doesn't die on my commute home. And one of the things that, the main thing that the researchers were able to take away was that the critical areas to those youth were untouched. Poverty was not impacted. The level of poverty, the number of people impoverished was not changed. Having these additional technologies didn't give them better jobs. It didn't create a better day-to-day living environment. In fact, the quality of life, day-to-day quality of life, was most frequently appreciated by those who are already in wealthy areas, that those individuals who were in the more wealthy neighborhoods were able to really appreciate some of the smart technologies that were incorporated into their communities. And yet many of the high-rise tenement buildings, many of those apartment complexes in poor areas along the rivers and in areas that had been part of that industrial decline, were left completely unchanged. And so these teenagers were going home from their schools to apartment buildings that still had no internet, that had unreliable electricity. Even if their parents were able to pay the bills, it might flicker on and off because the infrastructure had never been touched, it had never been improved. That still had dirty water coming out of their faucets. There was still a large degree of homelessness. It had just migrated. It was no longer in the city center where they were increasing tourism and highlighting all of these technologies. The homeless were simply pushed out. The police force and social services were migrating them further into the edges of the city where they wouldn't be seen so much by tourists. Crime was still rampant in those other post-industrial areas, and drug abuse numbers had increased, not decreased. And so when they thought about transformational, life transformational changes, they said nothing's different, nothing's better, nothing has improved. All of this technology has made day-to-day life more convenient and shiny for those who already have. And yet for those who had not, they were still living in the same slums that they had been living all along. They were still dealing with the same issues with crime and poverty and homelessness that they had been dealing with all along. The smart city had not made a single difference in their day-to-day existence. And so this is a cautionary tale as we think about how we integrate technology to benefit the public. Which public are we benefiting? Who is actually engaging with the benefits that are being brought about? We have capabilities to do amazing things, but who is receiving access to those things? And so when we think about the delivery system, one of the things that we have to think about for ourselves are, where are those places where physical distance, geographic disparity is causing us to focus on some communities that are easier to reach and maybe speak our language, or are able to transport themselves to a community gathering or a public hearing or a civic debate. And who are the people that couldn't even show up? Who are the people that couldn't get there? Who are the people that may have some doubt about whether or not this is actually going to make their lives better, or if it's just another example of a fun advancement that is for the haves, while the have-nots continue to exist in their day-to-day routines without any of these improvements. What sort of baseline user requirements are incorporated into this? One of the things that came out of the Philadelphia study was they were saying, you know, the elderly populations were not able to understand the change in how the public transportation bus fares were working on the cell phones, that they didn't know how to download the app. They didn't know how to link their bank account to the pay within the app so that they could buy, instead of having an old swipe card, like we used to call them in New York City, Metro cards, to pay their bus fare, or cash on hand or coins, that if they were supposed to use their phones, well, what if they didn't have a smartphone? And if they had a smartphone, who installed the app and showed them how to link their account? Because they didn't understand how to do that. And so the basic skills, the baseline user requirements were causing this technology to be more cumbersome on those who were already struggling, while those who had the proficiency and had the tools available thought it was great and thought it was a wonderful advancement. And so those are just some examples of where issues can be overlooked when we're not talking to all of the constituents who are impacted by these changes. Another thing that comes out through this work time and time again is that those who are in vulnerable situations often have to spend a lot of their time in unpaid work. So if you have a 2-hour commute, that part of it involves walking or biking because public transportation doesn't reach the facility that you're going to go work at. When you have those situations, your 10-hour day with 2 hours on either side becomes a 14-hour day. And what about childcare? What about if you have an elderly family member that you're responsible for? When are you cooking? When are you doing laundry? As we extend our days with additional labor that is part of our day-to-day involvement of just simply being people, if those things are additionally cumbersome, if you have to do your laundry at a laundromat instead of your own personal washer and dryer, if you have to wait for public transportation rather than driving your own car, if you have to work an off shift, and so going to fulfill a doctor's requirement or going to participate in some sort of civic meeting that takes place at 5:30 p.m. because most people will be off work, if you're working second or third shift because that's the job that you were able to get, your voice is never heard. And so understanding those types of barriers that exist to these other vulnerable populations, we in our effort to cater to the largest majority, we end up neglecting those populations that really need the most attention, that need the most support. And we might have the best heart to say we want to make life better for everyone, but then we create systems that reach only certain populations. We do things in a single language that other people can't understand. We conduct meetings in locations that not everybody can get to, or at times that aren't feasible. And so those types of barriers mean that our delivery system itself and even our mechanism for gathering information becomes flawed. And as we have flawed information, we then create systems that have built in unrecognition of those that are outliers. We have pursued ways that are not welcoming of all individuals, that are not inclusive, that are not equitable, because our entire paradigm was based on a concept of sameness. And so Melinda Gates writes in her book, The Moment of Lift, where much of her book is focused on international efforts of the Gates Foundation, although some of them are domestic as well. But as she looked and discussed the different places that the Gates Foundation had funded for social justice and to bring technology to try to increase equity for different populations, she said, diversity is one of the best ways to defend equality. But equality is a milestone, it's not the summit. We actually don't want to end at equality. She says, and these are her words, the supreme goal for humanity is not equality, but connection. People can be equal, but still be isolated, not feeling the bonds that tie them together. I can't be happy if you're sad. I can't win if you lose. If either of us suffers, we suffer together. This is her definition of a connected global population that is engaging with one another, that looks beyond simple terms of, do we all have the same access? Do we all have the same Google Chromebook in our hands when we leave the classroom? Do we all have the same technology available to us as we go to these different places that we travel? it's beyond those questions. It's looking deeper to say, even if we have the same tools, do we have the same training to use those tools? If we have the same training, do we have opportunities to share that experience together? Have we made the investment that is beyond simply, I'm looking out for myself, but come to a place where we view our society as a society in which we all must thrive together for any of us to feel successful, that for any of us to feel that we have achieved or accomplished, that we all must be engaged in this together. And I think that's maybe impossible. That might be an unreachable goal, but I think it's good to have unreachable goals. I think it's good for us to keep our eyes set in a place beyond where we are, beyond what we as a single individual can do, which is why, you know, I kind of wanted to set the tone before I even began speaking, that this is not an easy idea to solve. There's no linear trajectory that can be drawn to say, do A, B, and C, and you'll get results X, Y, and Z. It doesn't work like that, and it never will. And one individual person is not going to change the landscape for all people. However, if each of us in our own spheres bring a mindset of what resources are we looking to develop, what technologies are we looking to integrate, how are we disseminating that information? Does everyone have the same capabilities as they use these tools? Do they understand how they can be used? Can they recognize the same potential that everyone else can? Are we actually on that level playing field as we begin to work with these different technologies? Are we listening to all of the voices, or are we only listening to the people who showed up? And for the people who couldn't show up, was it a lack of desire, or was it a lack of possibility? Was it outside their realm of resources, transport, understanding, financial means to be a part of the conversation? And if that is true, then how can we bring them into the conversation? And how can we take those outlier pieces of data, those sample sizes of one, and give those voice just as much respect and weightiness as we would to the larger population that we base the mean on? And can those intentionality in our data gathering and in our analysis and our design lead us to use engineering and technology in a way that actually makes the world not just more equitable, but deepens connection of the society that lives within it? So my question for the rest of the time that we have together is, what comes next for us? And this is where I'd like to open it up to just open discussion, whether it's what you've seen in your own classroom, whether it's what you see in your own community, thinking about who may or may not have a voice within those that you interact with, places that you've seen technology bring about great change for all, or places where we've maybe missed the mark. Really, this is just open time for you guys to share your thoughts and for us to just engage in discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can go back to this view. And I know some of you have cameras, a lot of you just have your profile pics, which is absolutely fine. But I want to invite, there's 28 of us. I don't know if you, so Kendall, I think I see a hand raised. Kendall, did you want to talk? I mean, please, are they able to unmute themselves? I don't.
Yes, they should be.
Okay, so you should be able to unmute yourself. So Kendall, did you want to kick us off? Or you can also type in the chat. Any thoughts? Do I have any K-12 educators here today, or people that have been part of the K-12 system? Chat or comment?
I actually had a question related to that. So I know we have some social work students here, and we may also have some other students or people who are involved in the K-12 system. So, you know, school social workers, teachers' aides.
Yep.
other people who work in that system. Do you have any thoughts on those positions or those people? What can we do to keep this in mind and make things as equitable as possible?
Yeah, I think those are just my own thought, and then I'd love for them to contribute. I think that those positions are in a unique opportunity to hear from some of those marginalized populations, that they actually are gathering data one student at a time, and that's so valuable. And I wonder, because I know it wasn't true in my own children's school, but if when they were having staff meetings and faculty meetings, that those individuals weren't always necessarily included. Sometimes they were covering classrooms so that teachers could be present. And so we lost those voices, right? You know, you lose out on those individuals who are seeing the most vulnerable students, who are seeing those who have special needs at home or additional support required in the classroom. And they weren't able to talk about it. They weren't able to contribute that in those group forums. And so I think that is a great group that's probably underutilized from my own personal experience. And so I just wonder if anybody else has experience in that directly, what their thoughts may be. I also think that's a good thought to keep in mind. You know, where do we have individuals who already have access to vulnerable populations, where their day-to-day interaction is connecting them with vulnerable populations? And are we tapping those individuals for feedback as we look at new policies, as we look at integration of new technologies, as we look at changes to our infrastructure? Those individuals who already have perspectives that could help give voice to vulnerable populations, are we including them in the discussion? I mean, that's a really kind of low-hanging fruit in this type of endeavor, and I'm not sure how well that's being utilized.
Agreed. Thank you. Other questions, comments?
I have a comment more as a parent than an educator, but I did notice when schools went virtual that for my public school child, that he was in some ways it was a benefit for him, because I think he found it easier to advocate for himself if he could, you know, discreetly send a message than like raising his hand in front of everybody. I think in some ways that was easier. And it has, you know, he's since graduated, but in some ways I feel like it was one way that technology could be helpful. And as you know, as the shift has gone back to everybody, like the need to be in person, because that's a, you know, there's a real concern and need with that as well. But that as everyone got so sick of the technological options and wanted to switch back to in person, I feel like there were some of advantages of technology that have been kind of pushed by the wayside because everyone was just sick of it. So I feel like it would be great if there could be a better integration of taking the best of both worlds.
Absolutely, I agree with you. And I know that some of the adjustments that we've made, you know, during the most difficult strains of COVID, where we were at home, to back face-to-face here at USI as faculty, that we've maintained some of those. You know, I know numerous faculty who still Zoom on a regular basis for a fully face-to-face class to help integrate individuals who maybe it's not an illness, maybe it's they worked a late shift and they're going to Zoom in from home because they just got off work 15 minutes ago. And if they had to physically drive to campus, they would never make their class on time. But by being able to Zoom in, they're still able to participate. And so I do think that the integration of those technologies that are helpful, instead of it being an all or nothing type environment, that a blend, certainly, while it can require a little more strategy on how best to apply it, I think that opens up more opportunities. And so listening to all of the voices and all of the perspectives, to understand that for some individuals, those types of opportunities were more helpful. And so while many kids might benefit just from that face-to-face instruction, and it might not bother them to raise their hand in class, that for those who had alternative means, that maybe we can use technology in a new way to continue to engage them and be respectful of where they are. And so I think the all or nothing thinking is always going to lead us to a path that will exclude others. And blending and learning how to use the most of all of our resources rather than simply focusing on one that works for most people, that's certainly the blending strategy would be more advantageous.
Hi, so I'm Dev Matthews. I'm in the social work MSW program, or the master's program. And one of the questions I have is from a mental health perspective. I know a lot of the schools are flip-flopping back and forth between online school, in-class school, etc. And I know when I went to school, you know, if you had a snow day, you had a snow day. You didn't get transitioned to online classroom settings. So I guess I've got a twofold question. What impact is that having on the students that live in the country, especially in our local area, where they're actually missing class because the school decides to go online, where the parents aren't prepared for, you know, whatever mechanism, taking to McDonald's or taking to the library? And then secondly, what impact is foreseen in having that on their mental status of never really getting a break from the screen, if you will?
Yeah, I can't answer the second one nearly as well as the first, but there's a lot of work that's being done right now that shows that individuals are being left behind, that they're getting behind. And that has a mental toll as well, outside of just the screen fatigue that I think all of us have experienced over the pandemic. But our children especially, that those that are in communities or residential situations that don't have access, that they're simply behind. And while certain teachers may make accommodations for that, for them to make up the work after the fact, that's a teacher to teacher choice, or faculty to faculty choice. It's very hard to build policy around that. And so they are actually documenting individuals who are falling behind because of that disparity in internet access in their residence, where, you know, maybe they could have gotten to school that day, but school was put online that day and they can't do school online. And so they're simply behind. And I think many teachers are sensitive to not penalize them, but it does mean that if that teacher picks up the work saying, well, you should have done this online yesterday, so let's go on to, you know, the next chapter, you know, that individual is not only behind for the work that they've missed, but they're now out of sync with the rest of their group. And that certainly has a stressful impact on that individual as they try to catch up. And again, as we've seen in many of almost all of these studies, that the most vulnerable populations are the ones that are greatest, have the most impact then when these types of things occur, that they are most negatively impacted by these changes. And that's a very real issue that's continuing.
Hi, I'm a USI nursing student, and I wanted to comment on that, as I agree. But I know around my rural area where I'm from, the parents struggle a lot with that because they'll have their elementary school kids not being able to go to school that day, so then they can't go to work. And then because they can't go to work, they might lose their job, so they can't, you know, not go to work. So then their kid ends up, you know, not having to go to school that day, or they have to try to find a babysitter or what have you. And I feel like that causes a lot of stress for the parents as well.
Yeah, and childcare is one of the most frequently noted things for all of these societal measures that are being done. Anytime that there research is being done in a community with how infrastructure and technology impact different societies, childcare is always a main feature, because for more privileged populations, that they either have family support or potentially a situation where one of the parents is able to stay at home full time, either because they work a remote job or they're able to only have a single income in that home. Those things are not options for many of the vulnerable populations. The jobs are not able to be done remotely. They have to be at their physical place of work, and they don't earn wages that would allow a parent to stay home full time. They don't necessarily have a support system that would give them someone for them to send over to stay with their child. And so it does, it perpetuates this cycle of children, you know, you leave a fourth grader alone at home because you can't miss work. Is that fourth grader really going to get on Zoom all day to do their school for a snow day? that would be a really resilient fourth grader if they're able to. So yeah, it's an unreasonable expectation for those vulnerable populations, and those vulnerable populations are some of the students who need the most support, who need the most access to their teachers. So it's a vicious cycle the way it's set up right now. Well, it's 12 noon. I know some people have been needing to go. I want to encourage everyone. This was just the first session. There's 2 more sessions, including our wonderful keynote. And so I want to encourage everyone to participate in the fullness of their offerings today. I thank you for being a part of my session in this discussion, and I hope that it was beneficial, that it was valuable for your time. And I just appreciate the opportunity to have these thoughts with you and share them. But it's a great setup for today, so please enjoy all that the day has to offer.